The chair went over backward and hit the church floor like a gunshot, and every head in Plum Coulee turned to see who had stood. The preacher had stopped mid-sentence with his hands still raised. At the front of the little whitewashed church, a woman in a borrowed gray dress stood alone, where a bride ought not to stand alone, her face set against the thing that had just been said about her out loud, in front of God and the whole town, by the very man who had sent for her. And into that ringing silence, a cowboy nobody had been watching rose from the back pew, set his hat on the bench, and said 4 words that came down on the room like weather. "She's mine. I'll have her." If you have ever stood somewhere everyone agreed you did not belong, stay with me, because this is the story of the morning a quiet man claimed a woman the whole town had just refused. Subscribe to this channel and stay with me to the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let me take you back 3 weeks, to the railhead where it started, so you understand exactly what it cost that cowboy to stand up in that church and say what he said. Her name was Ada Mercer, and she had come west to marry a man she had never met, which was a thing women did in those years when there was nothing left behind them to stay for. She was 30 years old. She had been a seamstress in St. Louis and a nurse before that, in the war years, when she was scarcely more than a girl and the hospitals took any pair of steady hands they could find, and she had learned over a washtub full of horrors that her hands did not shake at things that made strong men faint, which was the one gift the world had never thought to thank her for. She was a large woman, and had always been. She had spent 30 years learning the particular arithmetic of a body the world had decided was too much. How to enter a room sideways, how to take up less of a bench than she filled, how to apologize with her shoulders for the space she could not help occupying. She had answered the advertisement of one Harlan Voss, a prosperous merchant in the town of Plum Coulee in the Dakota Grass, who wanted a wife to keep his fine house and stand beside him at the front of the church he had half paid to build. He had asked, in his letter, for no portrait, and Ada had taken that to mean a man of sense who cared more for character than for figure. She had let herself, on the long ride west, believe a small, careful hope. She should have known better. Men like Harlan Voss do not decline to ask for a portrait out of indifference to appearances. They decline because it does not occur to them that a woman might arrive looking like anything other than what they ordered. The stage driver who carried her the last leg from the railhead had tried, in his rough way, to prepare her, not for Voss, but for the country, and for the other man whose land they passed in the last hour of the ride. "That there's the Calder place," he'd said, nodding at a sound, spare ranch tucked against the breaks of the river, a place that was kept, but not grand. "Eli Calder runs it alone since the sickness took his wife and his little girl 3 winters back, inside the same week. Diphtheria. Whole valley had it. He nursed half the county through that quarantine and lost his own family for the trouble, and folks say he ain't been to a church or a dance or a supper since. Don't say 2 words to anybody now. Keeps his cattle and keeps his grief and keeps to himself." He'd looked at Ada sideways then, taking in the size of her, and had the decency at least to say the cruel part gently. "Voss is a particular man, ma'am, about appearances. I'd brace myself, was I you." She had braced herself. It had not been enough. Harlan Voss met the stage in the center of Plum Coulee with half the town arranged behind him to witness the arrival of the merchant's mail-order bride, and when Ada Mercer climbed down from the coach, he looked at her the way the world had always looked at her. The long, slow measuring look that starts at the crown of the head and travels down, the way a man measures a piece of goods to decide whether it is worth the freight. And then, in front of all of them, Harlan Voss did the cruelest thing a man can do to a woman who has crossed a continent on a hope. He laughed, short and disbelieving, and he said to the crowd more than to her, "There's been a mistake. I sent for a wife, not a draft horse." And the laughter went down the street the way it always did, easy and warm, costing them nothing. Ada Mercer did not weep, and she did not run. She had learned a long time ago that turning to face the laughter only gave it a place to land. She bent and picked up her single trunk, everything she owned, 2 dresses and a Bible, and a roll of nursing instruments in waxed cloth, and a small crock of starters she had kept alive all the way from St. Louis. And she stood in the middle of that street with her chin level and asked, of no one and everyone, where a respectable woman might find a room until the next stage out. And Eli Calder, who had come to town that morning only for nails and salt, and had stopped at the edge of the crowd with his hat in his hand, watched a woman absorb the worst the world could do without bending, and did not laugh, and did not forget it. The trouble was that Harlan Voss, having shamed her in the street, had been shamed himself in front of his town by his own bad manners, and a small mean man cannot abide that. So he had let it be known he would do the Christian thing and go through with the wedding after all, would condescend to marry her, and let the whole county watch him be generous. Which is how Ada Mercer came to be standing alone at the front of that whitewashed church 3 weeks later, in a borrowed gray dress, while Harlan Voss, who could not even then resist an audience, told the preacher and the pews that he was taking this woman more as an act of charity than of marriage, and that no man in his right mind would call a woman built like her a bride. That was when the chair went over in the back of the church, and Eli Calder stood up. He had not planned it. He told her so. Much later, he had come to the wedding the way the whole town had come, because in a place that size a wedding is the only theater there is, and he had sat in the back meaning to leave the moment it was decent. But he had spent 3 weeks unable to stop thinking about a woman who picked up her own trunk in a laughing street and asked, with her chin level, where she might find a room. And when Voss said the word bride like a thing to be ashamed of, something 3 winters frozen in Eli Calder came loose all at once, and he was on his feet before he had decided to be. "She's mine," he said into the silence. "I'll have her." And then, because he was a fair man and could not let even a victory rest on a lie, he looked straight at Ada and said, lower, so it was almost only to her, "If she'll have me." Which is more than you ever asked her, Voss. The town did not know what to do with it. Harlan Voss turned the color of a brick and said something about a man not stealing another man's bride, and Eli Calder said, "A bride a man has just refused in front of God is no man's." And the preacher, who had buried Eli's wife and child and never once gotten the man to say a word in 3 years, looked at Eli standing there and seemed to decide that whatever this was, it was more life than he'd seen in him since the sickness. Ada Mercer, for her part, looked at the spare, quiet stranger who had stood up for her in front of the people who would not, and she had been disappointed by men too many times to mistake a grand gesture for a safe harbor. "I don't know you," she said. "No," Eli agreed, "but I've a place that needs running and no one to run it, and I'd be square with you, and I won't ever ask you to be smaller than you are." He picked up his hat. "Come see it. If it doesn't suit, I'll drive you to the railhead myself, and no hard feelings." She went, not because she trusted him, she had no reason yet, but because the only other road led back onto a stage and out of a town that had laughed at her twice, and a woman of 30 learns to choose the door that is open over the one that is shut. The Calder place, when she saw it, was a sound house gone to grief, which is a particular thing to see. The barns were kept, and the fences tight, and the stock healthy, because a man can pour himself into the work that has nothing to do with the inside of a house. But the house itself had the look of a place a man only slept in. A child's chair still sat at the kitchen table, pushed in, never moved. On a peg by the door hung a small sunbonnet, gone gray with 3 years of dust that no grown hand had been able to take down. And the kitchen, the heart room, told the rest the way kitchens do. The range was choked with cold grease and old ash. The shelf above it held a row of little tin cups sized for a child's hands, every one of them dull, because to wash them would have been to admit the small hands were not coming back. The pantry was a widower's poverty: salt pork and hardtack and a sack of beans, nothing that took the time a person takes when there is someone to feed. Ada set her crock of starter on the cold range. She looked at the small gray sunbonnet on its peg, and she did not touch it, because she understood that some doors are a man's alone to open. Then she took off her shawl and rolled her sleeves to the elbow, because work was the one language she had always been able to speak without apology. She scoured the range to its true black iron. She threw out the spoiled stores and scrubbed the pantry to the wood. She found the well rope frayed to its last threads and replaced it before it could drop the bucket and foul the water, a thing no hired hand had thought to do because none had thought it was theirs to mend. And on the third morning she baked bread from the starter she had carried across half a continent. And the smell of it went through that grieving house like something coming back to life, out the window and across the yard to the corral, where Eli Calder stopped with his hand on the saddle and stood very still, like a man hearing a voice he had given up on. He came in at noon and stopped 3 steps inside the door. He did not look at the bread. He looked at the little tin cups on their shelf, which she had not touched, and then at the steam on the glass, and for a long moment the man could not seem to look anywhere at all. Ada cut the heel off the first loaf, too hot to be sensible, and set it buttered at his place, and gave him the dignity of her back. She heard the chair. She heard the long quiet. When she turned, the plate was clean and he was at the window with his back to her, shoulders set the way a man sets them when something is moving in him he has not given leave to move. "When did you last eat a meal made in this house?" she asked. It was a while before he answered. 3 years, he said. He had not meant to say it. He went back out to the cattle. And that night, after Ada had gone to her room, she heard him on the porch. And in the morning the child's chair had been carried out of the kitchen, not thrown away. She found it later, set careful in the dry corner of the barn loft, but moved, which she understood was the hardest thing she had watched him do. And she said nothing of it. Neither did he. They went on like that into the early autumn, 2 people whose work fit together better than their words did. And Ada found a small, dangerous hope growing in her again that she did not dare look at directly. And then, the sickness came back to the valley. It started with the Hendry children down on the flat. The fever and the gray membrane in the throat that the whole county knew on sight and dreaded. Diphtheria. The same that had emptied half of Plum Coulee 3 winters back and taken Eli Calder's wife and daughter inside a single week. By the 3rd day 4 households had it. And by the 5th, the town doctor, an old man who had buried too many during the last round, took to his bed himself with it. And Plum Coulee found itself in the grip of the thing it feared most, with no one left who knew how to fight it. No one but the woman they had laughed out of the street. Ada Mercer had nursed diphtheria in the war hospitals before half the people in that town were born. She knew the membrane and the way it choked, and she knew the desperate measures the books would not yet print. The steam tents, the swabbing, and the last terrible resort when a throat closed entirely and a child began to go blue. The small clean cut into the windpipe. The quill or the bit of reed slipped in to carry air past the blockage, a thing that took a steady hand and an iron nerve and the willingness to be blamed forever if it failed. She had done it before. Her hands did not shake. She went down into the town that had refused her, and she did not wait to be invited. She set up steam tents in the church where her wedding had collapsed. She swabbed throats and broke fevers and sat the night with children whose own mothers were too sick to sit with them. And on the worst night, in the Hendry cabin, when the smallest girl's throat closed entirely and the child began to go blue and dark in her arms, and the mother screamed and the men in the room turned away, Ada Mercer laid the child on the table and took the smallest knife from the roll of instruments she had carried across a continent and made the cut, clean and certain, and slipped the reed in and breathed for the child until the child could breathe for herself. The little girl lived. She would not have, in any other hands in that county. And the men who had turned away saw what the woman they had called a draft horse could do that not one of them could do, and there is no unseeing a thing like that. But the sickness does not care who is brave, and on the 8th day it reached the Calder place, and it took the child Ada had not even known was watching her, for Eli had a niece, an orphaned girl of 6 named Lily that his late sister had left to him, who lived shy and silent at the edges of the bunkhouse and had crept closer to Ada every day since the bread, until she slept some nights now at the foot of Ada's bed like a cat that has chosen its person. Lily woke one morning with the fever and the gray in her throat, and the whole frozen heart of Eli Calder cracked open in plain terror, because he had buried this exact thing before and could not survive burying it again. He did not have to. Ada Mercer fought for that child for 3 days and 3 nights without sleeping, with the steam and the swabbing and her own breath, and on the worst night, when Lily's throat began to close, Eli Calder held the lantern with both hands, while the woman he had stood up for in a church made the same clean, terrible cut she had made in the Hendry cabin. And the child drew air and lived. And in the gray hour after, with Lily breathing easy at last between them, Eli Calder began at last to talk, looking at the sleeping child and not at Ada, the way he did everything. He told her about the week 3 winters back, the wife and the daughter, the same sickness, and how he had nursed the whole county and could not save his own. He told her he had stopped saying their names because saying them felt like agreeing they were gone. He told her he had stood up in that church without knowing why, except that he had watched her not break, and something in him had wanted, just once more before he died, to be near a thing that did not break. He said it low and even and terrible, and when he was done he was quiet a long while. Ada did not tell him it was all right. She did not crowd the room with comfort to cover the size of what he had set down. She sat where she was, her hand near his and the saved child breathing between them, and let the silence be as large as the grief was, which was its own kind of answer, the kind that says, I am here, and this is real, and I will not pretend it is smaller than it is. Toward dawn his hand crossed the last few inches and closed over hers, and they stayed like that until the light came gray in the window and the worst of the sickness, in the town and in the man, had finally broken. When the quarantine lifted, Plum Coulee did a thing it had never done for anyone. The people gathered in the same whitewashed church where the wedding had collapsed. The Hendrys, whose girl was alive, the families of every child Ada had sat the night with, the old doctor, recovered, who said plainly from the front that he had practiced 40 years and never seen the windpipe cut done cleaner, and that the woman had hands he'd trade his own for. And Harlan Voss, who could not stay away from a gathering, stood up at the back to say something about how the woman was, after all, only doing what any decent person would, and trying to claw back the standing he had lost. This time it was Eli Calder who was already on his feet, and he did not let Voss finish. She is my wife, he said. And this time he had asked her, in the gray dawn after Lily's fever broke, and she had said yes, so it was true now in every way the word was meant to mean. 3 weeks ago this town laughed her out of that street, and you, Voss, laughed loudest, and then the sickness came, And the same woman you wouldn't call a bride walked back into this town that shamed her and put her own breath into your children's lungs. The Hendry girl is alive because of her hands. My Lily is alive because of her hands. The doctor here is alive because of her hands. He looked around the church, at the whole of Plum Coulee. Every one of you measured her in that street, and you measured wrong. There is not a soul in this valley fit to call her too much of anything. He turned to Voss last. You sent for a wife and turned away the best woman ever to step off that stage, and you'll live in this town the rest of your life knowing it. That's punishment enough. The door's behind you. It was the most anyone had heard Eli Calder say in 3 years, and it was not long, and that was why it landed the way it did. Harlan Voss left Plum Coulee before the first snow, having found the town no longer willing to laugh at his jokes. The Hendrys named their saved daughter's middle name for Ada. Some of the town changed that day, and some were merely shamed, but not one of them ever again said the cowboy's wife was too big to be a bride, because they had all stood in one room and watched what she was worth, and there is no unseeing a thing like that. Spring came up the river breaks late and then all at once. The little tin cups came down off their shelf, washed bright, and were used for Lily first, who grew tall and unafraid and called Ada by a word she chose herself. And in time for 2 more children born on the Calder place, who would never once be told there was too much of them. The small gray sunbonnet Eli took down himself one morning and gave to Lily to wear, and Ada watched him do it and understood it was the last and hardest door, and she let him open it alone. He said his first wife's name easily now, and his daughter's, having learned that a beloved name is kept by the saying and lost only in the silence. Ada Calder baked her bread every morning of her life from the starter she had carried out of St. Louis and kept alive through everything, and the smell of it went out the window and across the yard and down the river road, and travelers passing would lift their heads and wonder who lived out at the Calder place and ate so well. And when sickness came to the valley, as it did, it was her door they knocked on now, at any hour, and she never once failed to open it. The country was what it had always been, wide and old and indifferent, taking what it took without asking leave, putting its dead under the snow and giving back the grass each spring. But there was a sound house on the river breaks with a warm range in it and a woman who had stopped, somewhere between a laughing street and a clean cut that saved a child's life, asking anyone's pardon for the room she filled. She had been told, in front of a whole town, that she was too big to be a bride. She had lived to see that same town owe its children's lives to her hands, and a quiet man stand up twice in the same church to call her his. And she had come to understand at last that she had never been too much. The world had only ever been too small to know what to do with a woman that strong. And she stayed.